Hey everyone, this is Nick with my week 4 responses to your videos. Thank you so much for your comments and your thoughts and your perspectives. I noticed a number of themes across the videos that I watched, and even though they were consistent themes, there were different points drawn out. Some similar points, some differing points, which I think just goes to show that our individual contexts and social locations can have an impact on how we interpret the same reading or the same video. So, uh, jumping right into it, Chris, you talked about how contemplative practices are perhaps less common in our Protestant churches or denominations than in other faith traditions. And I thought that was interesting because we are talking all about contemplative practices here and even drawn some parallels to spiritual disciplines. And even though they may not be completely the same, they are perhaps analogous on some level. So, the question begs, why do we not do more, or maybe do not see more contemplative practice in uh, Protestant churches? So it's an interesting thought, which ties into a question. I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit too. A question that Ryan had asked, and also that Richard had touched on. So again, some similarities, yet some differences. You both kind of asked questions to this point of contemplative practice in our local churches, and Ryan and Richard both, essentially asking how can contemplative practices be identified and nurtured and implemented in our local churches, right? You both touched on those themes, and I think it's a great question to ask because again, we talk about spiritual disciplines. While they may not be the same thing as contemplative practices, but I think some of our churches and folks in our churches would recognize some of it. So if we start drawing dotted lines between the two, maybe we can start implementing or identifying and implementing some of those. So interesting questions. How can we amp up our worship or change our worship or supplement our worship in some way using these contemplative practices, which tie into a sense of communal contemplation. Ryan, you touched on this as well. Communal contemplation, how it is a reconnection to the divine in the midst of dehumanization and oppression. No matter what that dehumanization or oppression might look like, when we are in communal contemplation, we as a people can begin to work through this together, binding together. Which Eve, you hit on this, and boy, I used to put a big star on this as I was listening to you. You shared that we are deeply connected with God on the inside, so that we can be deeply connected with others or in communion on the outside. Therefore, if we are deeply connected to others, in communion with them, we cannot be indifferent to others' condition. I thought that was just so powerful. If we are truly connected with God on the inside, so that we can be deeply connected with others on the outside, again, being in communion with them, if we are deeply connected, we cannot be, what's the word you used? Indifferent to their condition. So again, big star. I really love that. Now, Eve, you also talked about subversive and prophetic roles within the book and in the video as well. And Ryan, I believe you touched on this also. These ideas of subversiveness and prophetic roles. And, subversive has such a negative connotation. But as I was thinking about it, subversive roles in faith and in ministry and in contemplation, wasn't Jesus a little subversive in the context of his culture and his community, doing things almost a 180 to what common knowledge or faith leaders would have told others to do? He spent time with the marginalized and the sick and the poor, when others would say, hey, we got to keep those folks at arm's length. So, this notion of being subversive might sound negative, but might lead us down to some interesting paths for change. And then Ryan, you talked about culture and place, how they play a role in how spiritual contemplation is viewed and practiced. And I think that goes back to this idea of social location as well. I'm currently practicing in somewhat rural northeast Nebraska. Contemplative practices there might look different than in urban or metro areas of Omaha, Kansas City, Lincoln, larger communities, Topeka, Wichita, etc. And even how we view contemplative practices in northeast Nebraska, it's going to look different than perhaps very rural communities of the Sandhills of Nebraska or perhaps southwest Kansas. And so, again, great contemplation, great themes, great perspectives, and even though there were some similarities, still some differences that were pulled out, all of which I truly enjoyed. So thank you for teaching me yet again one more week, and look forward to hearing your comments in the weeks to come. Take care.